Are you looking for a great way to improve your speed, power, explosiveness, and overall athleticism in a short period amount of time? Well, today we're going to talk about French contrast training, what it is, how you can implement it, get the most of it in your training program. Let's get to it. Hey, it's Smitley here from Thirst Gym, and today we're going to talk about something called French contrast training, which is an advanced training technique used to enhance your speed, your strength, and your power in a short period amount of time. Now, before I go too far deep into the French contrast method, I want to make sure you understand this is an advanced training technique. This is not for novices or beginners. This is somebody that's had probably a year or two of experience at a minimum in a strength and conditioning facility or using strength and conditioning based methods, comfortable with plyometrics, speed, power, general strength training, and everything that you can happen to find in a strength and conditioning room. So that's not you. This probably isn't the best method for you to see the most improvement in your performance. However, you probably still can take some things away that you might be able to use here and there, but ultimately understand the French contrast method is incredibly versatile in terms of improving movement, power, and speed, but it is advanced, so it may not just be the best method for you. But if you have been in the strength and conditioning room for quite some time, you're a high-level high school or college or even pro-level athlete, the French contrast method is where it's gonna be to help you peak and perform your best when it matters most towards those big competitions. Let's talk about the method. All right, before we get into the French contrast method here, I want you to give you a little bit of background on how this kind of came to be. So it was devised by a French track and field coach, and he used this and came up with this method through combining two other methods, complex training and contrast training. So essentially he looked at taking heavier exercises paired with lighter exercises to benefit off what's called the post-activation potentiation. Essentially what that means is that after we do a heavy load on our body, our nervous system output is upregulated. And so then we go to do something lighter, since our nervous system output is regulated higher. Now when we go to do a lighter exercise, we are getting more of a stimulus from our motor units because they use what's called the all or nothing principle. So they will always fire all out or not at all. So since we're doing a heavy exercise and then we go to do a lighter one that's ideally working in that same plane or a similar movement, we're gonna get a bigger output, and therefore we're gonna be able to stimulate more motor units on a lighter exercise, which is then ultimately gonna help us in our more athletic based movements together. So he took the contrast training and the complex training and combined them together, which generally was using a heavy exercise and a power exercise, or a heavy exercise and a light and speed exercise. And he took those four approaches, mashed them in together, and that's what is the French contrast method. You'll probably see this a lot in collegiate-based strength and conditioning programs, more so than anywhere else, because it is a great optimal way to maximize progress in athletic-based movements, train athletic-based movements, still train for strength, and see that upregulation and that output. The only pitfall of this, though, is it only lasts so long. You can't do French contrast training week in, week out, 52 weeks out of the year. Your body will just adapt to the needs that you're giving it all the time, and therefore you're gonna see minimal returns as it continues to go. But if you save it for when you really need it, peaking for big competitions, big meets, very important athletic endeavors, and you build up into it over the course of about 3 to 5 weeks, you're gonna see that your output is much better, and then you're gonna have better performance outputs, which is what we're trying to do as strength and conditioning coaches for you athletes. And then we mash these together so that we can do that and optimize our time in the strength and conditioning room on the things that matter the most when it comes to our performance, which is usually those big time meets. If you're having to be high school, sectional, regional, state-based stuff, if you're college athletes, that could be rivalries, conferences, or even national championships. So understand that this method should only be used sparingly, maybe a couple times per year at the absolute most, for when you want to be your best. Again, I can't stress this enough, don't do this all the time. Let's talk about the exact implementation of the French contrast method and what some examples might look like to really help you get the most from this method. All right, so the first step in our French contrast training is using a complex, big exercise movement. This would be things like your back squat, your front squat, your hex bar deadlift, your bench press, or you can do an inverted row or pull up if you want to do a pulling variation. Notice that these are big quality strength-based exercises. And as we talked about, the goal here is to get a high output from the nervous system from those exercises. So ideally, these need to be loaded between 80 and 90% and done for about 2 to 3 reps on average. You might be able to do some sets of 5, but generally you'll see them performed for sets of 2 to 3 based upon the intensities that we're working at in that 80% range. What this is gonna do is give us that high output, so then we go to the next step, we're gonna have that output carry over into that exercise. The other thing I want to make sure I'm very specific on here is you ideally want to do these in the same planes. So I just talked about doing a front squat or a back squat. So we want to look at things that are developing vertical power, vertical displacement, things that are going to help you jump high in this case in terms of triple extension, and the squat, with the front squat or the back squat, either one, clearly you're moving up and down and applying force into the ground to stand up, so we want to try to mimic that movement pattern. If I was going to do something like a broad jump, sometimes I will really like an RDL or a hex bar deadlift. Even though you're still moving vertically, many times that exercise translates over very well into a broad jump. So you're doing something moving forward, do an RDL or a hex bar deadlift in this particular instance to be able to mash it up with some of the exercises we'll talk about here in a little bit. If you're doing a bench press, clearly you're doing a horizontal press. You could do a vertical press too. You could just do a push press or a standing overhead press. That would also work well if you're trying to press things up. Generally, you're gonna see the bench press be kind of the go-to upper body exercise here, and same kind of loading method, 80% range for about 2 to 3 reps. And then if you're wanting to do this from a pulling based perspective, you could do this with heavy bent over rows, like a pin lay row or a barbell row. The only thing I really iffy on here is that you got a heavy load that you're bent over with. Usually not gonna be the cleanest movement, but it can be done. Usually you'll see this done more for a pull-up or a chin-up, doing a heavy set of 2 or 3 by adding weight, or if you can't do pull-ups, in this case you would actually give some assistance so you can do 2 to 3 reps, but essentially that's going to be your strength exercises that you're going to use for part 1 of the French contrast method. Okay, the next exercise you're going to do is going to be what's called a high force plyometric. So essentially this is going to be an exercise that is obviously considerably lighter than what we did for our main movement, but we're able to put as much force as we can into the ground. If we're talking about vertical work, a lot of times you'll see this with tuck jumps, you'll see this with hurdle hops, you'll see this with box jumps, things you can get a high amount of force out of, and there's not a whole lot of weight. Every now and then you might see these slightly weighted if you've got a very athletic based athlete, but generally speaking, go with a body weight variation on this and you're gonna get what you want out of the exercise. So you'll do your squat pattern and then a box jump, for example. If you're doing a hinge based movement, again, we talked about doing an RDL. Now you're gonna find something like a broad jump or a single leg broad jump to work on pushing forward. If you're doing that upper body exercise after that bench press, this might be a push-up. This could also be some kind of push press. It could be a lighter bench press. So you could, if initially we're doing 80%, you could now go down to do something around 30 to 35%. Doing the pushing is a little bit harder, but generally for me, I just like to go with a good old-fashioned push-up and make sure that there's pushing the push-up as explosively as possible, like a plyometric-based push-up. And again, if you're doing some kind of horizontal-based pulling, you did your pull-up. More cases than not here, a med ball slam would be a good alternative because you're still gonna have some load, you're still gonna use the lats, and it's still going to be explosive and plyometric in nature. So that covers our part 2. Generally for these, you're gonna do anywhere, again, between 2 to 5 repetitions. In more cases than not, you're gonna see a lot of training programs just match the reps that you do in your main movement. So for example, if you did a set of 3 on your back squat, you would do 3 bodyweight vertical jumps, tuck jumps, whatever vertical jump exercise you're doing, you would do 3 repetitions of that before moving on to this next step. All right, the next part of this method is using speed strength in our next exercise. Now, if we follow the force velocity curve, we know that this is using a light weight and going incredibly fast. So it's going to be a little bit heavier than the exercise or movement that we did prior, but we're still going to try to focus on speed being of importance. We're just going to slow it down with a little bit of load. We talked about our vertical displacement. 2 exercises that I usually see or use personally in this instance is a weighted vertical jump. So giving the athlete something around 10 to 15% of their body weight in load. So if you're a 150-pound athlete, you're probably gonna wanna have 15 to 30 pounds total in your hands performing body weight vertical jumps. The other option that you see here a lot is a hang clean or a power clean with around 30% of your estimated 1 rep max. Again, this is gonna be incredibly light. It's not going to necessarily be heavy, but the goal is to really force at triple extension to be as fast as possible with load. I've even seen coaches use this with high pulls because they feel that they can get more load out of the exercise, which is then ultimately gonna let them use more weight, but you still would technically be working in that 30% range of your best high pull if you're using a clean variation. Then the other option when we talk about like some of the upper body stuff For example, usually in the bench press here, what you'll see is you'll see some kind of like push press or some kind of high force output exercise like a bench press versus bands. That also works really well. Or you might even have a med ball throw laying on your back where you're gonna throw the ball up as high as you possibly can. I usually find that's not usually heavy enough, so I personally like to use anything that's gonna have a little bit more weight on it. So I really like using push presses and push jerks for these exercises. And while it's not in the same plane as our horizontal pushing, it lets us get into that load that we want and we're still being somewhat explosive. You could, of course, grab a heavier med ball if you really wanted to. So in my case, I would probably use a 30 to 50 pound med ball to push that up as high as I can, because that's gonna be a little harder than me doing a plyometric push-up, but still getting that same output. And then if we were looking at like a pulling based exercise, you could actually load up a sled with ropes or something, and you can make sure that you're pulling incredibly hard every single time and being explosive in that regard, but it's still weighted to some degree versus when we didn't weight the other previous exercise beforehand. So as step 3, as you can kind of see, we're going with a heavy max effort based load. Then we're gonna go to a plyometric based load, ideally with no weight. And then we're gonna go to a plyometric load with some kind of weight, or a weight or exercise or movement that slows us down a little bit more, but we're in that speed strength continuum area. Again, match your reps to what you did previously. It just makes the programming a lot easier. The only change that I would make to that is if you find that you don't have enough time under tension of doing the exercise, then you might be able to add more reps or take some away. But in more cases than not, if you're doing about 2, 3, 4 reps on all these, you should be in a good spot. So let's talk about the last piece here of the French contrast method. All right, we're gonna talk about the final piece of the French contrast method, which is what I like to call the realization piece, or the realization activity. However, you also see it called the deloaded activity, or the overspeed activity, or the realization-based activity. They're all viable answers. The goal here is that it's gonna be the easiest exercise of the 4, and the goal is gonna be to be overspeed or as fast as possible and explosive in this exercise. So this should be the fastest moving exercise that you're gonna do of the group. And that's the easiest way to think about when it comes to programming and implementing it. Now, when we talked about doing our back squat as our main movement, and then we went into our box jump, and then we went into our weighted jumps or our hang cleans, the next is then going to be that realization exercise, which I like to use any kind of band assisted jump. It's a very common exercise to use in the French contrast method, is to use a band assisted vertical jump or band assisted split squat or something of that nature. The other option you can do is if you happen to want doing some kind of speed in terms of running, this is where you would put your 10 to 15 yard sprints to be able to see the realization of all that extra work that you did from the first 3, so that your realization was actually feeling when you go to run, you should feel snappier and faster, and hopefully even run faster times if you would happen to time these. The main thing to understand here is that when we look at our force velocity curve, we want this to be the fastest portion. So generally in your force velocity curve, at the very, very top is your heavy stuff, which is kind of where we were. And now we're down here at the very, very bottom where that line is starting to flatten out, because we're moving faster than the amount of weight that we could ever possibly do, which is why we're getting assistance like with a band. So hopefully you can see again how this completely comes down the curve to benefit our French contrast method. Again, if we were gonna do like a broad jump based example, we would just do a band assisted broad jump or a cannonball chaser as a good exercise to throw us forward more to see the realization. If you're doing an upper body based exercise, usually this can be like a band assisted plyometric push-up. This could be a band assisted or reverse band bench press. And I've even seen people use a super light med ball for this, like a 4, 6, or 8 pound med ball laying on the ground to be as fast as possible, because that's incredibly lighter than ever pushing clearly a barbell or your body off the ground with a regular push-up. So you will have to get creative with this to some extent. You are gonna have to sit down, map things out, make sure it makes sense that you're checking the right box for the right portion of where you're at in the French contrast method for each exercise that you're doing. Again, these need to be sequential. And so this can be a pitfall of this exercise, because depending upon how your strength and conditioning room is laid out or the gym that you train at, if we just take the back squat, for example, and we were using the clean, I would have to have a place that I can back squat. I've got to have a box nearby that I can jump on. And then I have to have a bar set out for my hang clean. And then I have to have a band assisted jump set up on a similar rack or somewhere nearby as well. So you can see how this can take up a lot of real estate in a gym if you happen to be training independently. But generally you're going to see this on a lot of team or group-based settings. So it's usually a little bit easier because you can own the room with several athletes. But it is something to consider that the logistics of doing these exercises can be very challenging. Now, when it comes to actually progressing these, again, I talked about that you don't want to overextend your time using the French contrast method. You're gonna wanna do this again for 3 to 5 weeks. And so if you're doing sets of 3, we'll use the squat because it's kind of been our go-to here. We might start off with 80% for 3 in our first week. We'll do our box jump for 3. We'll do weighted jumps just to make it easier. We'll do our weighted jumps at the minimum weight, which for me is 10%. So we'll do 10% of our body weight. And so for me, that would be 15 total pounds. So I would really only grab probably, 5-pound dumbbells per hand, maybe 6-pound dumbbells per hand, 8-pound dumbbells per hand. Do my jumps, and then I would do my band assisted jumps for 3, and then I would rest for about 3 minutes, and then I would repeat this again for 3 sets. Over the course of the 3 to 5 weeks, the goal would be to increase load on the back squat or your main strength movement. It doesn't have to be a lot. We're talking 2 to 3% increases of trying to do 2 to 3 reps each week. It should be manageable and doable, but by the end of that 3rd to 4th week, you probably will start to feel tapped out, and that is very common. Your box jump height probably isn't gonna change a lot so long as that your mechanics stay pretty good. You might see your box height go up just a tad bit, but nothing crazy. And then your weighted aspect for your weighted jumps will then obviously go up a little bit as you're able to. You clearly will be limited a little bit based upon your dumbbells because dumbbells only make certain jumps, and depending on how much you weigh, you're gonna have less options there. But you do have some ways that you can just completely jump over time. So every other week, you might be able to go up a couple pounds per hand in those jumps to be able to see progress. And then on your band assisted jumps, if you really want to get gnarly with it, you can start with a lighter band initially on. And then by the time you're in at your 3 to 5 week training cycle, you can use the strongest band that you have access to, which is going to give you the biggest assistance that you can possibly get. So then you're going to see at the end, you're using the heaviest load with the most assistance, which should then give you the most output from a nervous system perspective to be able to benefit from the French contrast method. All right, that's gonna wrap up everything here on the French contrast training or French contrast method to help you be a more explosive and powerful athlete. Again, I can't state this enough. This is an advanced training method, so please do not use this if you consider yourself a beginner or intermediate, or you're new to the strength conditioning world, or you're new into sports, or you're new into using strength conditioning to aid your sports performance. I would not recommend this method early on. Start with the basics of your basic strength movements, your basic plyometrics, and your general exercises that are going to help you move and feel better and get generally stronger in several planes of motion. Once you've done that, then the French contrast method to me is actually worthwhile for you. And I have several seniors in high school that I use the French contrast method with as we begin to approach certain aspects of their training career or big time meets that they really want to try to perform well for, or big time outings if they happen to be getting recruited. Again, very demanding based exercise, but it's also key that you make sure that you're putting exercises together that sequentially make sense, that are going to benefit off each other. And that's usually the biggest pitfall of this, is that if you pair the wrong exercises or you're in the wrong areas of the force velocity curve, you're not really doing French contrast method. You might as well just do general complex training, which is be doing a heavy exercise and a power exercise as an introductory based way to get used to it, and then branch out towards French contrast training, which I think is a great segue to get into it. Again, I can't recommend this enough. 3 to 5 weeks is about as long as you want to do this, maybe 2 to 3 times per year to maximize your results with it. Otherwise, use your general strength conditioning based methods to continue to see improvement in your sports performance. This is a fantastic method. I really love it. I cannot explain how awesome that it is. However, just make sure that you're using the right exercises. If you happen to be looking for any kind of help with the French contrast method, just leave me a comment in below and I will let you know, hey, that sounds like a great idea. Maybe we switch some things up. I'd be more than happy to help you. As long as you can tell me kind of what you have access to, we'll be able to get the ball rolling and help you put some exercises together that are probably going to make sense. Again, I appreciate you checking in. Before you go, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't to, and I'll make sure I catch you at the next video.